My name's Ivor Sarakinsky. I'm a professor in the Wits School of Governance, and I'm going to give a short talk on decision-making and governance in the era of COVID-19. Difficult issues, but some things worth looking at in a little bit of detail. Detail that you won't easily see in a lot of the existing popular media and popular literature on this issue. So how does one begin making sense of all of this? Let me introduce the context. It's very easy to make decisions when the routines of science, of policy making, of government are all established and functioning reasonably well, or functioning at all. The accepted ways of doing things help solve so many of the decision problems and challenges. It's much harder to respond to a novel new event, something that hasn't been experienced before, or if it has been experienced, it's been a while back, a long time ago, 1918 Spanish flu, and the lessons, the experiences have been forgotten. And it's hard to learn from those previous events because of the space in time. So you're facing an impossible situation in a sense. You've got a problem, a severe problem. You know it's severe, but you don't know what the mechanics, you don't know what the detail of that severity are. And as a decision maker in government, in business, in trade unions, in civil society, in community organizations, in residents' associations, you've got to find ways to cope with this event that has suddenly crept up on you and hit you from behind. You've got to find a way of responding. So, in a sense, you're dealing with an uncertain situation, an unknown situation, and you've got to find a way to be able to manage the situation through the decisions that you make. Decision making is hard at the best of times. It's extremely challenging under the conditions that I've just set out, the conditions of this global COVID-19 pandemic. So what are the issues, what are the challenges in decision making that are important for us? Well, how do you make a rational, evidence-based decision where the knowledge that you need to make such a rational, evidence-based decision is lacking, because it never happened before? You don't know anything about this new thing that is suddenly in front of you. So it's very hard to respond rationally and omnisciently and correctly because you don't know what's going on. You don't know the virology, you don't know the epidemiology, and you certainly don't know the socioeconomic impacts that this challenge is going to have at the time that you're going to make the decision. Much easier in 5 years' time when we look back. We should have done this, we should have done that. Much, much harder at this point in time looking forward to know exactly what the right things are to do and how to make the right decisions and how to factor in all the variables that are so important. And you can't know all of that because it's new, it's novel. So uncertainty, you don't have all the information, you don't have all the variables that you would like to have. So we've got uncertainty, we've got a whole range of unknowns. And some unknowns less unknown than others, but lots of unknown unknowns. How do you deal with that? Big problem. In decision making, cognitive biases are a very serious challenge. You cherry pick, you go with what's familiar, you have a confirmation bias. You choose information and situations that fit in with your expertise, your prejudice, the readings that you've done, countries that you've looked at. And these biases skew your evidence base, they skew your interpretation of what's going on. There are no controlling databases in place to manage those biases easily, if at all, because of the novel nature of this. Also very important in impacting on how you make a decision in this context is time. You don't have infinite amounts of time to weigh up everything, to do experiments, to do tests, to do comparative studies of other countries. You've got to act. You've got to make a decision. You've got to do something. Because what you do know is that this is really serious And if you don't do anything, large numbers of people are going to get sick and die, and you're going to have significant socioeconomic repercussions. So time and urgency force you to make decisions in a difficult environment in a quick way, rather than taking time to gather as much available information as possible. A third factor that makes this also very complicated and hard is organizations. Organizations are bureaucratic routines that structure the way information is collected, collated, processed, analyzed, interpreted, and acted upon. And we often exaggerate how rational and effective and efficient organizations are. The garbage can theory, a famous model of organizational functioning in decision-making literature, shows that it's organizational anarchy. People are there who don't really know why they're there. Everyone's punting a particular view. The views are different. Not everyone is always at the same meeting. So it's very hard to get consistent, evidence-based, rational decisions out of organizations because of the bureaucratic human all-too-human condition that operates and functions within organizations. So often what informs decision-making in this context is what we call the precautionary principle. If you don't know, you err on the side of caution. And in this case, you err on the side of caution in terms of trying to save as many human lives as possible. And morally and ethically, strong arguments can be made for that. So making decisions in this environment, in this context, is always going to result in unhappiness and dissatisfaction. People are going to disagree, people are going to be unhappy, people will have alternative views. And that's understandable in terms of what I've just said. It's trial and error. You'll have some successes, you'll have some glaring mistakes. And it's very easy with hindsight to look at what the mistakes were and are. It's not that easy to get it all right at the time that you've got to make these difficult decisions. One hopes that one will get more right than wrong in acting in these environments. So you make a decision in the context of all the issues I've mentioned already, and then you've got to execute your decision. It's hard enough to make the decisions. Everyone's going to be unhappy, large numbers of people will be unhappy, especially with lockdown, changing the way people live their lives. And then you've got to enforce, you've got to execute, you've got to administer your decisions. And that makes the situation even more complicated, because in a constitutional democracy like South Africa, civil liberties are entrenched. And people rightly are questioning the way government has restrained individual rights and people's rights to do things that they usually and normally do. It's important to note that in this context, many liberal political philosophers, John Stuart Mill in particular, say that under conditions like this of disaster, it is perfectly justifiable to suspend civil liberties for good reason. And the good reasons are harm to individuals, harm to society. So for government to act, it has to restrain or suspend the rights and freedoms that we've become accustomed to. That doesn't mean that one just justifies everything that government does, and I'll say more about that in a second. So government is using disaster legislation to enforce the lockdown, and there are unfortunately far too many instances of abusive enforcement, treating citizens badly, heavy-handed actions by the security forces. And this raises the governance issue of oversight. Parliament should be pursuing its oversight functions, calling the executive to account for the behavior of so many officials under their command and under their management. And unfortunately, Parliament has abrogated its function in terms of performing that oversight role. But if we are going to think about governance going forward, we have to rethink governance. Governance isn't just about transparency and oversight, all the things that we're really familiar with. We need to rethink governance in terms of co-production. Our leaders in government, in public should be seen as custodians of a process of co-production where they bring all sectors of society into a decision-making process so that you can govern with as much consensus as possible based on people driving the decision-making processes as much as is possible. So we need to rethink things like leadership, like management, like the executive, in a new way, an alternative way of understanding different ways of doing and practicing governance. Co-production, facilitating dialogue in society so that people contribute to the decisions that they live under and that govern them. So in conclusion, what's the big issue here? The big issue with COVID-19 is that it's novel, it's a black swan event, it's a once-in-a-generation event, and managing it is a balancing act. You don't have all the information you need or want. You've got to balance competing demands and competing pressures in society for different engagements and for different freedoms and different rights to operate. So you've got to save human life on the one hand. You've also got to enable the economy wherever possible to function, because livelihoods are important and you can't just push the economy into lockdown because there's no guarantee it will ever start up again. And the hardship of unemployment and not earning salaries is also an ethical and moral problem. So you've got to balance all of those things. You've got to find a middle ground. You've got to find a way forward in this uncertainty, a way forward that will keep as many people as possible alive, keep as many people as possible out of hunger, and enable an environment where the country and the world in reality will come out of this in reasonable shape to start to rebuild. So, in short, making these decisions, it requires the wisdom of Solomon. If anyone thinks that this is one-dimensional or simple or straightforward, they're missing out on this complexity, this open-endedness, this contingency, this uncertainty that is so characteristic of these novel, unique, once-in-a-generation events that all governments around the world are battling to find appropriate responses to. All one has to do is look at the infection rates and the mortality rates of other countries to get a sense of whether South Africa is on the right track or whether they've missed the boat.